Hi, my name is Nuno, and this is the Reform Review. We have quite a bit to talk about this week, less about actual news of the week this time, but more about what happened in terms of immigration reform, because quite a bit has happened, and I'm very happy to talk about it. And as usual, if you have any questions or any concerns, make sure to type them into the comments below. I'm able to monitor them, and I can try and give an answer in real time, or I'll come back and give you that information later. So to start, I do want to talk a little bit about what's happening at the US-Mexico border. The reason being that it is very central to what's happening for the future of immigration reform in the US, especially when it comes to trying to get Republican support for different measures. So let's start with that. And I'm going to handle it in a bit of a different way. Again, this is going to be the only immigration news topic we'll talk about, and then we're going to get into really all of the reform updates of this past week. So first, we want to actually understand what happened this past week compared to previous weeks. So to start, I do want to just quickly share my screen as usual, and to highlight this from a report by CNBC, where the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, finally recognized the situation at the border as a humanitarian crisis. The reason why this is rather important and why I'm highlighting it first is that the Biden administration, as it says down here, the administration is not calling it a crisis just yet. Even in discussions that the Director of Homeland Security has had, especially with Republican representatives, he has also shied away from allowing them to call it a crisis. Now, the reason being is that, as I mentioned last week, FEMA, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was implemented at the border to support the unaccompanied migrant children who are in need and are being affected the most right now at the border. So we're still seeing how this develops, but it is rather telling now that Democratic leaders are finally acknowledging that this is indeed a crisis. Of course, there is the caveat, and this is also something I like to highlight as well. This isn't all completely on the Biden administration. Yes, it does require implementing new policies to try and alleviate the problems there. But as Nancy Pelosi said, Speaker Pelosi, the Biden administration is trying to fix the broken system that was left to them by the Trump administration. The Biden administration will have a system based on doing the best possible job, understanding this is a humanitarian crisis. Importance of this is that it does tell us that there are some carrying over policies from the Trump administration that led to this. For example, we covered this extensively in the past, but the Remain in Mexico policy, which forced asylum seekers to stay on the Mexico side of the border while their applications were being processed. This led to a backlog, and what we're seeing now, as we covered last time, of over 50,000 asylum seekers still needing to be processed through the ports of entry. And so on top of that, we have many families and children, unaccompanied children coming at the same time. And so everything is kind of boiling up and kind of exploding at the border right now, which is being taken advantage of. Now, another one I want to quickly talk about, and just to highlight really what it looks like, or what happened this past week, is that more than 4,000 migrant children are being held by Border Patrol as of this past Sunday, including 3,000 in custody longer than the 72-hour limit, which is set by the courts. So what this is telling us is that the actual departments are being overwhelmed. The capacity in different facilities are reduced in general, and in overall, the Biden administration was not ready. They did not adequately prepare for this kind of an influx on such short notice over the past few months. Although it was leading up since the general election, so it wasn't completely surprising. So it is a bit concerning that the Biden administration did not consider this when they were transitioning in. Lastly is, again, as I mentioned, a backlog for processing. And this is leading to rather difficult situations inside of detention centers where children are being held. This quote in particular kind of spoke to me, and I wanted to share it with you all. Right, so children interviewed on Thursday, and this is 2 weeks ago, Thursday, by lawyers conducting oversight as part of a federal court case reported sleeping on the floor, being hungry, only showering once in as many as 7 days, and not being able to call family members. One of them shared that he could only see the sun when he showered because you can see the sun through the window. So this was citing interviews with nearly a dozen children, including an unaccompanied 8-year-old girl. So these are the kind of conditions happening right now in a lot of these facilities that are being overwhelmed, that the Biden administration is trying to address, but obviously it's not fast enough, not quick enough, or effective enough to meet the increasing demand, because week to week, more unaccompanied children are arriving at the border, along with more families to there as well. And they're still on top of that trying to process asylum seekers. So with that out of the way, right, this is what happened this past week and is what's happened in the past few weeks. We need to ask the question of why are so many people coming to the border to be processed and seeking asylum? So to answer that, I do want to look at a couple other articles. And just as a reminder, the reason why we're covering this is that it is central to the arguments being used against immigration reform by Republican representatives. So it's best to understand where they're coming from so we know how to best fight for reform going forward. So to answer this question, why are so many people coming to the border? It's really a combination of different reasons that I want to cover so you best understand it. According to Adam Isaacson, an analyst at the human rights advocacy group Washington Office on Latin America, this crisis, he says that it's over-explained by Republicans, but honestly, I'm in agreement. I do think this is a crisis. But he says that it is a perfect storm of factors. Hurricanes that hit Central America last fall, the economic fallout caused by the coronavirus pandemic, typical seasonal migration patterns, the thousands of Central American migrants already stuck at the border for months, and the persistent scourge of gang violence afflicting the Northern Triangle countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So, as I was saying, it is a very difficult time, whether it's natural disasters that are afflicting the area, the general violence, or because of the Trump policies, keeping tens of thousands of people at the border to be processed. And now, especially with the coronavirus, what we've seen in the U.S. was also affecting other countries, and those who are a little bit more impoverished suffered even worse. So this is all happening at the same time, causing this large influx to come to the U.S. And it's not something new. During the early beginnings of the coronavirus pandemic, we did see an increase, the early beginnings of an increase in migration towards the southern border. There is a report that shows that actually at the peak, there was a different peak even before the virus in April or spring of 2019, I believe, that the number of families and unaccompanied children at the border is actually much larger and a much increased rate than what it is now. So it's nothing new, but it is just at the worst possible timing as we're just trying to get a handle of the coronavirus and we're leading into midterm elections. So we're seeing a big complication that the Republican representatives and some other representatives are trying to take advantage of this situation, really a humanitarian crisis, for their own political gain. But that is not to distract that it is still concerning that the Biden administration does not recognize this as a crisis, even though it is. So to just continue on to that, just to really make it clear that it is partially this backlog of asylum seekers at the border. There is another report by the Associated Press that explains that in May of 2019, right, this is during the Trump administration, when he responded to an increase of Central American families and children, again, 2019, what happened was that his policies to remain in Mexico did affect the asylum-seeking process, whereas only less than 1% of asylum seekers won their case, just because it's much more difficult to find effective counsel in Mexico compared to in the U.S. So seeing this, what it tells me is that, yes, it is not 100% the Biden administration's fault. Some of it is coming from the previous administration, their policies causing their own crisis at the border, which then extended over. And that is coupled by the coronavirus, by the general violence, and now natural disasters completely out of our control. So it is definitely, as I said earlier, the perfect storm of bad circumstances, which is leading to this humanitarian crisis at the border. So that is, again, why there are so many people coming to the border. But it's also a matter of misinformation at the border. And this article kind of covers that, where badly misinformed, the migrants harbor false hope that President Joe Biden will open entry to the U.S. Briefly and without notice, or they think he may announce a plan that will put them first in line to claim asylum, though he hasn't said anything to support that theory. And so these are the kind of things that are being transmitted within the asylum camps at the border, which then extends back to their home countries and which drives the engine to have more people come to the border in hope of having access to the US to improve their lives. Again, because the situation in their home countries is forcing them to come to the US. They're not coming for any malintent or any reason like that. Of course, the human trafficking that occurs is always a concern and a worry that needs to be clamped down. But that is more or less the reasoning of why there's so many people coming to the border right now. But we also have to ask the question of why is this crisis so complicated? Because we hear many requests, especially from Republican representatives, that Biden has failed. He has failed to take it under control, and so it's his fault. And this is why we need to listen to their requests for stricter enforcement at the border, to reduce the asylum-seeking process, to take in less asylum seekers, and just in general, return back to Trump-era policy. Well, the reasoning is also a bit more complex. This story is going to be mentioned in a few seconds, but to start, it is, as I mentioned earlier, a mixture of COVID, reducing the capacity of facilities. I believe it's down even beyond 50% in some facilities, which means that the process of taking unaccompanied children and then moving them to a facility that is suited for their needs and their really has the resources to hold children rather than adult migrants is reduced. And so this is why you see the Biden administration being forced to open up other facilities, new ones, and reopen old ones in Texas. So it is definitely a situation that they are being overwhelmed just by the sheer number of children coming in. And as I mentioned, it is the process of trying to also bring in the asylum seekers who are remaining in Mexico, over 50,000 that still need to have their applications processed. So it is a constraining of resources. For example, in some of the detention centers, there aren't even volunteers who speak Spanish. That is the extent of this crisis and just the strain on resources. So this is why it's getting more and more complicated as we go forward. The Biden administration scrambling to try and get resources out there as we're asking him to, just that it's not effective or at the right level of quality for what is needed in this kind of a situation. And on top of that, we have this article, which really concerned me quite a bit. It is from NBC, and it was on the 17th, so very recently. It was on Wednesday. And what we saw is that the Biden, I'll read it out, and I'll kind of expand it here so you can read along. But the Biden administration is restricting the information Border Patrol agents and sector chiefs can share with the media as a surge of migrants tests the agency's capacity at the southern border, according to insiders. The officials say the restrictions are seen as an unofficial gag order and are often referred to that way among colleagues. The officials requested anonymity because they are not authorized to speak about the topic. Now, they've been requested to deny all media requests for ride-alongs with agents along the southern border. Local press officers are instructed to send all information queries, even from local media, to the press office in Washington for approval. And those responsible for cultivating data about the number of migrants in custody have been reminded to not share the information with anyone to prevent leaks. So what this says is really that the Biden administration is struggling to make the public not perceive this as a crisis. Again, I call it that way because that is, by definition, a crisis. You have tens of thousands of people at the border who need support, and you have thousands and thousands of unaccompanied minors who need representation and resources and adequate shelter to then be processed and come to where they can be placed with a family in the U.S. So it is by nature a crisis, and it's unfortunate that the Biden administration is doing this because it does reduce public trust of the process and makes it definitely look like the Biden administration is trying to hide something, even if it is a complicated process that needs nuanced discussion, and they are refusing to have that. So I'm not sure how far this will go. Again, it says down here that these new restrictions have been passed down verbally. So not through an official memo, it's nothing written, it's nothing official, but the unofficial policy has led some agents at the board to release videos that show mass arrests and surges of migrants without permission from Washington. So if you happen to have seen in the news any recordings or especially the conversation about buses coming to the U.S. border, this may be a result of these kind of restrictive policies, unofficial policies, which the Biden administration is trying to put in to limit the public perception of this as a crisis. Again, I think this is a horrible decision by the administration. I think you need to be very transparent during a time like this to prevent, especially Republican representatives, from taking advantage of this for their election purposes to then make the situation even worse. And this is something else I want to mention as sort of like wrapping up this particular question. Why is this so complicated? It is the fact that Republican representatives are trying to take advantage of this situation for their own political gain. Again, a very unfortunate circumstance that we're finding ourselves in, but still very concerning. And again, I do want to mention before we kind of talk about how they're doing this, is that as the Associated Press reports here, right, it is very complex. This spike is, I'll say the numbers here so you have a good idea of how it compares to times under Trump. But right now, they've met 18,945 family members, 9,297 unaccompanied children. These were the ones who were counted in February, right? And it's a rather large spike from January. As it says here, in terms of the family members, it's a 168% increase. For unaccompanied children, it's 63% from January. But when you look at the peak, and remember, this is the phrasing that Republican representatives are using is that this is the highest point it's ever been. This is, again, a crisis out of control. We have no control at the border, and this is why we must return to Trump-era policies. Well, during the Trump administration, in the spring of 2019, in May of 2019, those encounters, they encountered 55,000 migrant children. Of those 55, it was 11,500 unaccompanied minors, which again, the peak right now under the Biden administration is 9,297. So it's still lower than what we saw under the Trump administration, even with his hardline policies. And in terms of overall migrants in sort of a family unit, there was 84,500 in just the month of May in 2019. That is far beyond the 18,000, roughly 19,000 under the Biden administration so far. Is this to say that the Biden administration is doing a good job, that we shouldn't be worried, we should just be hands off? No, we need to continue to push the Biden administration to effectively alleviate this crisis at the border. This is not to be any endorsement of what's happening there, by no means, but it is to give some perspective against how the Republican representatives are trying to take advantage of this situation to prevent any comprehensive reform going through Congress. To kind of go on that, right, this is a quote from Representative Michael McCall, a Texas Republican, right? He says that this administration's actions have had a direct cause and effect on this humanitarian and border crisis. So if you happen to have seen the debates for the American Dream and Promise Act, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, or for the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021, you would hear this kind of talking point quite a bit. They would argue that there is such a crisis at the border that Democrats do not care about children who are being trafficked, about the harm that's being done, gang violence, and just in general, the suffering that's happening at the US border. And so we must prevent all reform from happening until we take control of the situation. These are the same people who didn't mind having the Remain in Mexico policy, sending people over the border into camps at risk of gang violence. They are the same people who had no problem with that, and yet they are here critiquing about this. I also critique this the situation as it is right now, but I at least have consistency, moral consistency, that both situations, whether it was under Trump or under Biden, is bad. We need to be able to provide as much resources that are necessary, effective ones, people who actually speak Spanish, legal resources, help these children go through into shelters that are adequate for their needs and also for families. The Biden administration is still using Trump-era policy to turn away migrants who are coming to the border. He only made the exception for unaccompanied minors, which is part of the reason why we see such an increase in unaccompanied minors coming to the border, because they are the exception to the rule. So what does this mean and how could it be addressed is the next question, and sort of the wrap-up question that we want to have before we get into how does this play into the immigration reform right now, and what does it mean for the future of immigration reform as we see it in our current time. Well, what we're seeing is that, and I covered this slightly, I covered it, I believe a week or two ago, but just to remind you of what the Biden administration is doing right now, which I do agree with, and I think it is perfectly fine. The first thing they've really tried to do is to undo some of Trump's policies, which made it more difficult for children to be matched with a family member in the U.S. So the Trump administration tried to increase the amount of information that was being shared with sort of the it's slipping my mind right now, Department of Homeland Security. And so that led to some people being detained and then deported. And so that discouraged a lot of family members from stepping forward to claim their children and house them in a more humane way. So the Biden administration is rolling that back. So that's step one, which I do agree with. And step two, which I think is even better, is a reminder that the Biden administration is allowing children to apply for legal status in the U.S. from their own country. So this would prevent them from having to make that journey, which, again, Republican representatives are hinging on, that they're saying that this is what Democrats want. They don't care about these kids that have to make this journey, and they're getting abused along that journey. They're being killed. They're being exploited. But this is what the Biden administration is doing. They're trying to prevent that from happening. So credit where it's due. I think that this is a brilliant policy that should be implemented. Give these children the ability to be able to apply and then be brought to the U.S. in a safe manner. So I think that this is the step going forward. But there is some other news that came up, which I did want to share. And it is that Mexico has suddenly decided to take a step forward in trying to stem the migrant trail at the southern border of Mexico. So just to read this to you, the Mexican government will carry out operations on the southern border to protect the rights and safety of migrant minors from several Central American nations who are used by criminal networks as a passport to reach northern Mexico. So this is very out of nowhere, and not many people expected this. There is some questions of whether or not this has to do with that the U.S. will be sending quite a bit of doses of the COVID-19 vaccine to Mexico. There may have been an agreement struck between the Biden administration, but nothing public has been said, whether from the Department of Homeland Security or even from the Biden administration, to confirm that these are coinciding. So right now we only have some suspicions that the U.S. asked Mexico to stem migration coming from Central America, to detain people there at their southern border, and in exchange for some COVID vaccines. Again, nothing official on that, just speculation, just from the convenience of things lining up the way they are. So this is really about, the tensions had begun back in Thursday, is what they say, when they stopped trucks, which actually held a total of 329 migrants. And of those 329, over 100 were unaccompanied children. So they are trying to work on that. Again, I'm not 100% on board with this because it doesn't really address the issues that these migrants are escaping. That's the very unfortunate part. They're being stopped in Mexico and then I'm not sure if they're going to be processed. Maybe the children will, or they're being sent back to their home countries. That is something to be seen. So this is really the state it is right now. In terms of how it could be better addressed, as I said, I think the Biden administration is taking some good policy initiatives, making it easier for children to be placed with a family member, and also, again, allowing these children to apply from their home countries is a brilliant step. We need to do a little bit more in terms of providing more resources to these detention centers. Again, I don't like the idea of detention, and especially because these children are being held there longer than what is legally required. That needs to be addressed right away, I believe. But at least giving them the resources they need for representation to make this process go faster, and also to provide those same resources to asylum seekers at the border. I know that they're on the Mexican side. Perhaps they can negotiate with the Mexican government to also provide protection at the southern border, because again, that is where violence is happening, at these asylum camps where people are being kidnapped and being exploited in that way. So these are the different steps the Biden administration needs to take right now, because, and now we're going to go transition into our next piece, right, which is about an update on reforms, because it is very intimately linked into what was happening at the border. As I mentioned earlier, for those who saw the debates, quite a bit has happened this past week in terms of the future of immigration reform. I'm going to share a couple of things in a little bit, so I'm just going to cue it up here. But just as a reminder, just a very brief reminder, that immigration reform in the U.S., and I'll zoom in again here, and I think I lost my place exactly where it is, but give me 1 second and I'll be able to pull it up. Yeah, there we go, perfect. I'll zoom in so you can see it, but this is your weekly reminder, I would say, because I'll always bring this up every week when we're about to talk about immigration reform and its current status, is that providing pathways to citizenship is a very popular topic among American voters. It has overwhelming support, especially for Dreamers. Here it says that it has 83% of support for creating a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. Compare that to 65% for a general pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants. So this is the majority of American voters. It is something that really the country wants and it's craving, not just those who would benefit from it. So again, this is just a reminder that when we're talking about this, despite what Republican representatives or moderate Democrats say, this is something that's popular. It is what is wanted in this country, and we need to act on it now to take advantage of this momentum. But just to continue on then, I do want to also share a concerning thing, is that although these kind of surveys and polls say we have a majority of support among the country, we're seeing this happen right now in our Senate, which is where these bills are going to right now, 2 of them, and I'll mention those. But just to tell you, right, especially when we think about the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, which is a comprehensive immigration reform bill, it's concerning that Senator Dick Durbin, right, he's from Illinois, he co-introduced the DREAM Act, right, the solo DREAM Act of 2021 with Senator Graham of South Carolina. But this is what he had to say when asked about comprehensive reform. Right? He says, "I don't see a means of reaching that. I want it. I think we are more likely to deal with discrete elements." Meaning, again, a piecemeal approach, or as I call it, the breadcrumbs approach, because it only helps a small portion of the immigrant community and abandons the rest. It's only giving us the breadcrumbs to keep us satiated and baited into supporting certain parties over others. So just to continue on this, because just to deliver the point, really, because my main concern and my main critique so far these past weeks has been the abandoning of comprehensive reform by the Democratic Party, despite a Democratic president pushing for it, introducing his own proposal, and then just also straight out abandoning it halfway through without pushing for it whatsoever. What we're seeing here, right, he continues, right? This is Senator Durbin. When we start getting into the other areas, it gets much more complicated. He knows that, talking about Senator Graham, the Republican. I wish we could move one piece at a time, but I don't think that's in the cards. This is him talking about something like the American Dream and Promise Act, something like the DREAM Act that he introduced. He's saying that that's also unlikely to go forward. He says that, and this is actually Senator Graham now, said that the border problems, again, remember as I was saying, they're using it as their excuse, make it much harder to reach an agreement. Right? He told reporters that he believes a comprehensive bill won't succeed this year. So already, Republican representatives have made it clear, Republican senators, that they will not support a comprehensive bill such as the U.S. Citizenship Act, and they will not support something like the American Dream and Promise Act, something like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, or something like the DREAM Act of 2021. They are against it. And so this is why it's concerning when you have someone like President Biden or Democratic leadership claiming, right? So they claim that the most important thing that they need to focus on right now is building bipartisan support. But so how can you build bipartisan support when it doesn't exist? They have told you directly that they do not support these bills, that they do not support your agenda, that they're going to use any and all excuses to block reform, to block any progress towards helping millions of people. And yet they're still going down the same route, using the same method and the same excuses that they need Republican support. There is a process that they're considering, budget reconciliation, within the next COVID relief bill, which is an infrastructure bill, that they can slide some of these bills in there and then push it with just their slim majority. But the issue is that moderate, right, and I put this in quotes because moderate doesn't mean what it should, but moderate Democrats will reject it. Senator Manchin, he has already said he will never vote for any bill that does not have at least one Republican supporting it. So he has already flat out said, I don't care if the vast majority, if over 90% of Democratic voters support this bill, I only care if Republicans support it. He is in the Democratic Party, but he is trying to act like a Republican, which makes completely no sense. But that is what's in the way right now. It is not just a Republican issue that is blocking these kinds of reforms. It is also a Democratic issue. Both parties are at fault in this situation. And that's what we need to recognize before we get reliant on a single party. Yes, they passed two bills in the House by the Democratic majority, and that's fine. But that doesn't excuse them from taking the easy way out of this. They have chosen to act against comprehensive reform. The majority in the House does not support comprehensive reform to provide a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants. They want the easy way out to do the bare minimum to help only dreamers, TPS holders, and agricultural workers to do that and say, we did the best we can, it's the fault of the Republicans. And that is a flat out lie. They are able to do more right now. They have the opportunity, the methods in their disposal to do it. It's just that they don't care. And the president also abandoned his own policy. He proposed it. He promised it. And now we're getting just a bare minimum out of it. And that is not right. And that is not what we should be accepting. But that rant aside, I do want to now kind of go back to give the summary and update on what is happening, aside from that some of these policies have been abandoned. In terms of the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, just to give a very quick thing, it's no surprise. We're still waiting for April to come, when it should go to the House Judiciary Committee for review. Again, it's looking more likely that the Democratic Party, along with President Biden, has abandoned this, and we will not see a comprehensive reform bill going forward. It'll probably be reviewed. There'll be some posturing that, that Democrats do care, that they're trying their best. But in the end of the day, when the president abandons his own bill and decides that he will not fight for it, there is no way that the rest of the Democratic Party will decide to do it for him. They're going to take the easy way out and just leave this be. So that is really all I have for the U.S. Citizenship Act. In terms of the DREAM Act of 2021, that is also unsure what was going to happen with this. Again, these quotes were taken from Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. They are the two who introduced the DREAM Act of 2021, and they're already both saying that it's unlikely that they'll be able to push this forward. It's also the case that I believe the Democrats are holding off on this because they're focused on the other two bills at this moment. I'll, again, talk about them slightly right now. But that is all we have in terms of the DREAM Act of 2021. No news so far. In terms of the American Dream and Promise Act of 2021, again, the bill number is H.R. 6. This actually did move. It was recently passed in the House on March 18. The vote came out to 228 yes, with 197 no. And it's worth noting that 9 Republicans supported this. Compare it to the last time this same bill passed, I believe in 2019, same name, same number. It only had, I believe, 6 or 7 Republicans in support. So it did increase in the Republican support in the House, but again, it is very unlikely, in my honest opinion, very unlikely that it will pass through regular means. I would be surprised if you can get 10 Republicans to publicly say that they will support this bill. When you look at the debates, when you look at what was being said, I'm going to show these comments that were made by Republican representatives when this was passing. These were comments made during the debates, and I'll read it out to you. This is by Texas Representative August Pfluger. He is someone who visited the border on Monday. Bringing an amnesty bill to the floor this week in the middle of a total crisis on our southern border not only is tone deaf, but is wrong. This bill will only incentivize more illegal crossings. What a week to put this bill to a vote. So this is within the House. And so you may argue, well, this is the House, not the Senate. So what would that look like? Well, Senator Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. And Mitch McConnell, if you don't know him, he has a very strong hold over the Republican senators in the Senate. Unlike on the Democratic side, where it's just kind of a free-for-all, as long as you support corporate interests, you're fine. In the Republican side, you kind of follow along what Mitch asks you to do. And so what he did is, on Thursday, he mocked the House for acting on legislation that does not address the recent increase of people detained at the border, noting that the Biden administration called in the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to help with the surge during a global pandemic. Are they leaping into action to repair the crisis? McConnell said on the Senate floor. No, they're taking up an amnesty plan that would create a special new pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants working in certain industries. This is his comments on the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, but you can kind of get a feeling that this is the same argument that are going to be made against the American Dream and Promise Act, as well as for the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. So the likelihood that this bill will pass is very slim because it does not have a lot of concessions that Republican representatives want. It doesn't harshly punish the immigrant community, and it doesn't put too many bars on restrictions of who would be able to apply for this in terms of Dreamers and even TPS holders. It does have the date, and it was not changed during debate, which I think was the only good thing that came out of this. The Democrats did hold strong and prevented it from being returned to committee for review to then change different aspects of it. So I'm glad that that didn't happen. But again, this isn't comprehensive. It's only helping a small portion. And again, this is my opinion. But I do believe that Republicans in particular, especially in the Senate, are too focused on winning back seats in the 2022 midterms, which are coming up. So they are trying their best to derail all reform by using the border crisis as an excuse. So a lot of these concerns and these grandstanding speeches that they give during debate or even after debate in their own press conference is very fake. They honestly don't care. A lot of their proposals are to just return to Trump policies, and that does not work. We did not see it work, and it's what led or fed into the current crisis. So it's very fake concern and not to be taken seriously, although it is concerning that they are using this to prevent any reform from going forward that would help millions of immigrants in this country. But that is the current state of the American Dream and Promise Act. It is waiting to be sent to the Senate. We don't have a date yet of when it's going to be reviewed, what committee it's going to. That should be announced hopefully next week or within the next few weeks. We're going to see what comes out of it. And I would imagine, depending on what happens to this bill, the future of the standalone Dream Act of 2021, that'll be determined once we see if this proceeds, if it's going to be included in the COVID bill within budget reconciliation, or if they're going to return to the DREAM Act of 2021 afterwards. For now, unknown, and I can't really say too much more about where it's going to go. Same kind of thing for the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It was also recently passed on March 18th, same day as the American Dream and Promise Act. I was very lucky to be able to just kind of watch the whole thing. Lucky to a limited extent. A lot of the debate from the Republican representatives was very hard to listen to. It was just all the same excuses. But it did pass and actually had quite a bit more Republican support. So as you're seeing down there, I'm going to stop sharing this screen as well so you can actually... So it passed with 247 votes yes, 174 votes no, but because of increase in votes, it is 30 Republicans in support. Compare that to only the 9 that supported the American Dream and Promise Act. So I do want to just talk a little bit about this because I have a particular opinion of why more Republicans supported it, and it's not this kind of romanticized view that Republicans just love immigrants out of nowhere, these farm workers, and that they wanted to give them a pathway to citizenship and their families. I believe it is because the agricultural sector is very important for a lot of these conservative states where Republicans are elected, and so since business and advocacy leaders all supported it within the agricultural sector, and they helped to craft this. They really did pressure Republican representatives to accept it and push it forward, because right now we have a shortage of labor within the agricultural sector to be able to meet our food demands. And food is very important. Obviously, we all eat. And in general, Republicans rely on this industry to get themselves elected. So having a bill that provides a legal workforce, which provides some protections and many benefits, will help grow the industry, the sector, and just help really America as a country in general to meet its own agricultural needs. Now, the other thing, which is a little bit less great, and I do not agree with this decision whatsoever, is that the bill would also implement E-Verify as a requirement for all the agricultural sector, meaning that all employers in this sector of the economy will have to report the legal status of their workers, meaning that, yes, again, and I explained this in detail in our last conversation about this, so I'm not going to go too far into it this time, but this is really the dream of Republicans, to institute E-Verify in as many sectors of the country, of the economy, or in general make it a nationwide requirement, which I'll talk into the last reform update. But this is my main concern, because what this means is that we are going to get, if this were to pass, we do get some help for the current undocumented community working in agriculture, which again, they deserve it. They work very, very hard to make sure that we have food to eat at our tables. The unfortunate part is that if this E-Verify system is incorporated in the sector by law, employers do not have the choice whether or not they want to use it, as they do now. What will happen is that the future undocumented community working these kind of jobs will have a much more difficult time trying to get a job. And on top of that, their rights will be abused at a higher rate, because now simply the employer just has to report them to federal officials, and they will be detained and deported at a much higher rate. So what this means going forward is that if it does pass, we will see an expansion of E-Verify to the point that it will not be removed in the future. Republicans will never let it be removed. Instead, they will continue to fund it, to grow it, and make the lives of future undocumented communities even worse. So take this as you will. It is helping us right now in the moment, but in the long run, Republicans win out with this E-Verify system because it does set them up for really what they want, which is increased restrictions on immigrants and especially damning punishments for undocumented immigrants in the future. So where this will go, I'm not sure. I do believe comparing the two, comparing the American Dream and Promise Act and this Farm Workforce Modernization Act, I think that this bill will have a slightly better chance of passing in the Senate, just because, as I'm saying, it helps different states that are Republican-led, and it has this E-Verify system, which is what Republicans really want in a lot of these bills. When they say bipartisan, they mean punish as many immigrants going forward as possible, restrict restrict them as much as you can. That is what they count as bipartisan. As long as that's included in the bill, they're going to support it. So we'll see what happens. Again, I think this has a higher likelihood of working. So I'm not sure what that means going forward for the Senate. We'll have to wait to see. It also hasn't been scheduled, similar to the American Dream and Promise Act. So we are going to be waiting to see if we get that information very soon, within the next week or two. But the last one I want to talk about is not a bill. It hasn't been formally introduced, but I did cover this extensively very recently. You can probably find the video on our Facebook page, or a recommendation will pop up somewhere here in post if you're watching this, playing it back on YouTube. But it is the Republican Dignity proposal, and I'm going to have some information scrolling across the bottom, some generic stuff that explains that it was introduced March 17th, so actually the day before the two bills passed the House, the American Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. So what this does is, again, I went into the full details in the separate videos. I'm not going to go into piece by piece. But just as a reminder, it is just a proposal, similar to when Biden first came into office and he proposed his U.S. Citizenship Act. It was just a proposal until a month later, it was formally introduced as legislation. I believe we're going to see a similar time frame for this one if Republicans actually want to go forward with it and aren't just doing this to derail conversations, which is my suspicion. I think that the reason why they introduced this was just because it was, again, a day before the other two bills were going to be considered, and this was just introduced as a way to push the Democratic Party more to the right, to meet them there, and just to then vote no on it, which is what they tend to do right now under the Biden administration. So I'm not sure how long it'll take for them to introduce this, or if they will formally introduce it, but it is worth noting that this is the only so it's only the second proposal for reform which includes a pathway to citizenship, for sort of a general pathway for all undocumented immigrants, not just for dreamers or TPS holders or agricultural workers. So yes, that's interesting that they decided to introduce this. I didn't expect it to have a general pathway, but unlike Biden's bill, and this is why I try and push so hard for the U.S. Citizenship Act, and I think that you should too, is because unlike the Biden bill, this proposal, it's very unclear how long this pathway would take someone to go from being undocumented all the way to having permanent residency to then eventually becoming a citizen. Because it requires applicants for permanent residency to go to the back of the line. It is quoted in there, go to the back of the line. So assuming the worst, because the way that this is set up is that you have a 10-year process of a dignity status, their dignity program. So you have to go through this entire 10-year process where, by the way, you have no access to federal aid. So if you were to lose your job and you need support, it may be the case that you will receive nothing from the federal government. And also, it's not clear if during this time you have access to state aid. So it could be the case that when this is written up as a formal law and submitted, it could be that they say that states also can't give you aid. You can only contribute. If that is the case, then I can see that this will become a humanitarian crisis within the country. Millions of people will be caught in a situation if we have something happen again like COVID, where people lose their jobs, everything slows down, and so we have to be careful with this proposal because, again, it is a proposal. It's just one page. Nothing is fully written out yet. So do keep that in mind. But just to go on with what I was saying, it's 10 years for the dignity portion, followed by an optional 5-year redemption program. And what this redemption program does is it sets you up on a pathway to get permanent resident status, so your green card. But it says 5+ years, meaning it's a minimum of 5 years, and then they could go on for however long until you, from the back of the line, are able to be processed to receive a green card. So, assuming the worst, it could take a minimum of 15 years, but potentially decades to shift to permanent resident status. And then from permanent resident status, you had to go through the process to become a U.S. citizen. So that could take more years and more money. So compare that to the Biden administration, who made it very clear you have a 5-year prospective status, which then eventually goes to become a permanent resident, and you only need 3 more years to become a U.S. citizen. Very clear, very concrete, explained that you only need 8 years to become a U.S. citizen from the time that you're an undocumented immigrant applying for this to being able to shift to citizenship. So 8 years or more than 15 years, I think the clear choice is to go with Biden's proposal. And this is why, again, I push it so much, because it is comprehensive and it is very clear. We have it to read and we have all of those details. Meanwhile, the Republicans proposed something like this, which would send people into decades of uncertainty while also holding them to a much higher standard compared to other citizens. You will not be able to access aid, and you'll, of course, have to pass continual background checks. Again, this is not fully written, but you can expect this to be the case, especially since it's a common trend within these reform bills that you cannot commit any kind of crime or misdemeanors while on these kind of programs. So imagine that. For 10 whole years, you have to be extremely careful. And then for another 5 years, extremely careful. And then for however many years while you're waiting for this. This is why this proposal is so concerning, is that they are explaining that because of the border crisis, this is the best that Republicans can propose, and this is something that Biden needs to do because this is the only practical way that we can reform the immigration system right now. And that is just a complete lie. This is just an insult. Really, really, really is an insult, a disastrous proposal. Because even in the first section, it prioritizes border security above everything. It has a requirement that says that if the border is not secure, no other reform should be possible. Meaning, again, in its current state, it's not explained. What does that mean? What it could mean is that if at any time the border is considered unsecure, they could cut all these programs for citizenship until they deem that the border is secure, meaning that they don't even have to provide a pathway to citizenship. They get everything that they want, meaning they get their fancy, beautiful border wall, which is something they're obsessed with, they have a fetish for, while also increasing restrictions on immigrants and enforcement of asylum seekers to prevent what they say is abuse of the system, which they have no evidence for. And so they will get everything that they need. And of course, the nationwide E-Verify system to prevent any undocumented immigrant in the future from being able to find work and to actually have some semblance of rights in this country. They would be happy to put that in, happy to send all this money to the border to make their wall. And on top of that, they don't even have to provide a pathway for people. They can just lie and say that they did because they passed the law, but then they can always claim that the border is unsecure and never give a pathway to citizenship. And I think that is one of the most egregious things ever, is to just completely lie in a proposal and say that that's the only way it's possible. Meanwhile, the U.S. Citizenship Act is just sitting there, not moving because the president does not support it, even though he's the one who put it forward. And Democrats are arguing that the only way to go forward is through bipartisan measures, breaking it apart. And then Republicans still continue to say that that's not possible. So we're seeing this kind of conflict of two parties unwilling to do anything to help people for completely different reasons. Republicans for their electoral reasons, because they're scared that they're not going to get their elected in the next midterm election. So they're hinging on this crisis right now. And that's all they have, besides culture war stuff, Mr. Potato Head and all that. All they have to feed us are lies and unpopular policies that no one wants. But at the same time, Democrats are taking this opportunity that they've been given to make comprehensive reform that will help millions, millions and millions of immigrants here in this country right now, but going forward, because this comprehensive bill of the U.S. Citizenship Act, forget this dignity proposal, because it's nothing really. But the U.S. Citizenship Act is the piece that will also help the immigration court system, the visa process, the asylum seeking process. It is the comprehensive bill that, if passed, will improve by a larger margin the immigration system as a whole for those who are here right now and those who will come in the future, compared to this breadcrumbs approach that they're taking right now, just trying to pass the DREAM Act. And it's still going to hit into a wall. So I do not agree whatsoever with this Republican proposal. I think it is just a waste of time, and that they're just doing it to, again, deflect move attention away from a comprehensive bill that will work, that would change so many lives under President Biden. But it's not completely, again, as I'm saying, it's not completely the fault of Republicans. They're just doing this because they want to survive as a party. It's also on the Democrats. They keep on raising up hopes within our community for reform, but then they fail to work together to actually get it done in a comprehensive manner. They'll just continue to rely on whatever is expedient and easy for them as a party. So it is very clear to me, right? Because when we're asking this kind of question of what does the future of immigration reform look like, I do believe that it is this partisan back and forth from both parties puts millions of lives at risk. And it does infuriate me because there is no reason why millions of immigrants should be played with, that their lives should be at risk just because two parties decide that one of them hates them and cannot be elected without having to show that they do. And then the other party raises their hope, takes advantage of the crisis and the needs that they have, and then doesn't actually deliver on it. For years and years, for decades that have passed, we've been promised reform. Since the early 2000s, we were told that there would be some kind of reform, and then nothing is delivered on. And a lot of the issues that we're seeing right now stems from some of the Democratic presidents. Bill Clinton made it so much harder for immigrants to receive government help when they need it, and in general made it difficult for the immigration system to process them, to actually give them some refuge here in the country. And Obama didn't really make things brilliant or much better. If anything, he detained and deported even more people. But again, never a pass for the Republican Party because they're even worse. So it is on us to make sure that we're not aiming at the wrong target. What we need is comprehensive immigration reform, one that does not value a smaller portion of the entire population over the rest, because that is how they make us fight against one another. And instead of working together to show them that we know what we need, not what they think we want. So, with that in mind, we do have to act quickly, right? If we do want the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 to be passed, to be pushed forward, and then hopefully passed, because, again, it provides a pathway to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country. It addresses the broken immigration system that causes this crisis, and also addresses root causes in the countries of origins of other countries to make sure that they have less reason to make that kind of a journey coming to the U.S. When Republicans say that that the Democrats aren't caring about it, it's included in that bill. So if they actually cared about what was happening and the reason why these children are coming to the U.S., they would support the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 because that is the bill that is addressing all of this in a comprehensive form. So what we need to do, we need to act right now, because similar to how the Republicans are acting and trying to gain their support ahead of the elections, moderate Democrats, those Democrats who try and pretend that they support our community, but then they will quickly flip and try and get as many Republican voters to vote them in when elections start to come back. We need to make sure that they don't have that excuse, that we're not too close to the 2022 election, where then these Democrats will completely abandon us. They won't even pretend or lie. They'll just say, I don't approve of this kind of reform because of the border crisis, because it's not supported by Republicans, because I actually support the Republicans' bill, even though I didn't support it a month ago and I supported this other, right? They will confuse the hell out of us with the amount of excuses they can come up with. But that is why we have to hold them accountable. It doesn't matter if they're Democrats. It doesn't matter if they're blue, red, whatever it is. If they do not support our community, and they keep on claiming it's because they want it to be bipartisan, that doesn't exist. And it shouldn't matter to us. It shouldn't matter to your family, to your brother, to your sister, to anyone. What matters to us is comprehensive immigration reform that helps all of the undocumented immigrants in this community. If they do not support this kind of bill, then we do not support them. That is the bottom line. That is how we need to approach this. When we organize, we hold people accountable, regardless of their Democrat, regardless of their Republican. This is why we need to support the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. It is the comprehensive reform that we need to be following and we need to push for. And so to do that, please right now, you need to start calling your representatives. As I mentioned earlier, they will begin to review this in April. This is what they're promising. This is what they're saying. So with that in mind, we are going to do a campaign where we're calling every day in the month of April to make sure that our representatives know that we're going to hold them accountable to their promise to actually push forward this bill. It doesn't matter if they're saying right now that they don't have the support. We'll make them have that support, because that is the important thing. Do not take their excuses. There's no reason to. They are there to represent us. And if they actually care the way that they say they care, then they need to support the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, not these breadcrumbs, not this piece-by-piece approach that they're trying to force on us. What we want is comprehensive reform. And to do that, if you already know who your representative is, call 202-224-3121. This will connect you to the congressional switchboard. An operator will pick up. They'll ask you, who do you want to talk to? Just tell them the name, Representative whatever, Senator Durbin, and they'll connect you to the office and tell them to their phone that I support the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. It helps my family, it helps my friends, whoever it helps, tell them, and then ask them, say, I want you, as my representative, to also support this. Come out in public and say it. Fight for it. Get your colleagues to also fight for it. That is what we need. So start calling now. Start calling now, but in the month of April, us as a campaign, we will do this every day, and I'll do it with you. I'll show you the steps, and we will get change done. So for now, that is the entire program. Again, thank you for being here with me. If you're watching this post in sort of a replay, whether if you're on YouTube, you'll see some recommendations. But please, if you haven't already, make sure to like the Facebook page, subscribe to our channel. It really makes a difference, and we are growing each day as we go forward, so I'm very thankful for that. But for now, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Or actually, next week, I will be taking a little bit off, so it'll be a pre-recorded video with news and different updates, so do keep that in mind. But beyond that, as always, I'm very happy to have you here and share this information with you. So see you next time. Bye-bye.